Okay, thank you everybody for coming. I'd like to thank you, Sandy, for coming down to Rockville. Sandi Leibowitz is the author of the poetry collections The Bone Joiner and Eurydice Sings, and the editor of the speculative micropress Sycorax Press and the online magazine Sycorax Journal, whose inaugural issue went live on Halloween 2018. She graduated from Vassar College with a BA in English Literature, received an MA in English from NYU, post-baccalaureate certificate in teaching from William Patterson, and an MLIS from Rutgers. Sandi's speculative fiction and poems may be found in Metamorphosis, Liminality, Through the Gate, Holotexny, Devilfish Review, Luna Station Quarterly, Mythic Delirium, Kaleidiotrope, Gaia, Shadow and Breath, 3, Strange Horizons, Goblin Fruit, Apex, Ellen Datlow's Best Horror of the Year 5, and other magazines and anthologies. Her poems have won second and third place Dwarf Star Awards and been nominated for the Pushcart Prize, Riesling, and Best of the Net Awards. She joins us from New York City. Thank you.
I don't think this is working, but
No.
I don't think I need it. So, so thank you very much for coming. And what I decided to do is divide this up into like 3 parts. So the first part, I'm going to talk about speculative poetry, and I'm going to read works that aren't mine. And then I'll read works that are mine, and then we'll do a little writing. So, so speculative poetry. So a lot of people look and say, I have never heard of this. What the heck is that? So if you've heard of speculative fiction, it makes it easy. It's just the poetry that relates to it. But speculative, I actually have a friend who's a writer. She writes historical fiction, and her response was, but all writing is speculative. Okay, that's true. It is. But basically, I'm not sure when I encountered the term speculative fiction and poetry, probably in like the 2010s or late, just a few years before that. And basically, it's an umbrella definition to encompass science fiction, fantasy, and anything that's not based like in the real world. So pretty easy. I like to call it poems of the fantastic or what have you. In the true, full spectrum definition, it includes slipstream, and every time I saw that, I was, what the heck is slipstream? And when I looked up, I was, oh, that's that stuff I don't like. So basically, sorry if you write slipstream. If I can recall, I mean, I haven't really delved into it. It's basically, I find it incomprehensible. So it's sort of like stream of consciousness almost. It doesn't make sense to me, so I don't understand it, so I can't talk about it. But so, in terms of my writing, I love science fiction movies. I love science fiction TV shows. I'm a Whovian. Yeah. Yay. But I do not like to read science fiction usually. I just don't. And because I have a very good friend here who knows me since college, so she will attest that I was never a fan of the 20th century. And so the 21st, so futuristic worlds, I'm not interested. I mean, sorry. But that's my particular thing. So a lot of speculative poets are interested in that. There is an organization, and that's the one that gives out the Dwarf Star Awards and the Riesling Awards. It's SFPA, which used to be, up until this year, Science Fiction Poetry Association. So you see, it was supposed to cover science fiction and fantasy and slipstream and all of the above, including horror. And it wasn't in the name, and we got to recently vote on the name, and now it's Science Fiction Fantasy Poetry Association. So the members of the group, well, you don't even have to be a member, but people who practice speculative poetry might write any of the above or all of the above. Mine is purely fantasy. So by fantasy poetry, some of you may be thinking, all right, so it's going to be like the poems, the rhyming sort of ballad-like poems like you would encounter in The Lord of the Rings, right? Tolkien interjected little poems and songs in his books. And that too, but it isn't necessarily that. So it isn't necessarily old-fashioned-y or pseudo-medievally or quest-like. Just like speculative fiction could include futuristic worlds, worlds that never were, horror, Victorian setting, but there happens to be a, well, actually, Frankenstein is speculative fiction. It's just so that's the fiction end, but the poetry end, if you think about it, I mean, I'm an English major, so there has been speculative poetry since the dawn of time, right? If you're writing about a myth, and you're writing about Apollo and Artemis, you're writing speculative poetry. It's just that only recently have we decided that that's a genre, and that there are genre magazines and genre anthologies that host them. But Shakespeare did it, Homer did it. If you go to any literary anthology, you will find probably at least one poem that deals with a Greek myth, a fairy tale. Like Anne Sexton's book of poems, I forget what they're called, that deal with all the fairy tales.
Transformations.
Transformations. It's been done for, like I said, since time began. Some of us just tend to focus on that. In fact, I was writing stuff, I've been writing since I'm a kid, and I always wrote a lot of things based on, I mean, like I said, I'm an English major. I live life through books. So I always addressed myths and fairy tales and things. I didn't know it was like a genre. And I always had what I call my weird stuff. And it was like, I finally was reading stuff online. And then I went, oh, this is my tribe. Well, why don't I start to send stuff out? Because when I started writing, I did have something, in the old days before the internet, young children, if you were a writer submitting, just to find the information, you would have to go to the library or a Barnes & Noble, there were Barnes & Nobles back then, and go to the place with all the anthologies and read them and look through their guidelines, and then you'd have to go home, figure out the rules, write down the rules you have on your little slips of paper or in your notepad, and you'd have to snail mail everything. And then you'd have to wait months for a response. So I did it a few times. I said, for a poem, to wait like a year and a half to get no payment whatsoever, it's like, I don't have the time for this. So I stopped actually submitting. And then at some point when I was reading this stuff, it said, why don't I submit? And then I started to get published. So I said, oh, I found my place. Now I know what I am. So that's how that works. So again, I'm not going to deal with the stuff I don't like. I'm not going to talk about the science fiction, the slipstream. But to me, basically, when you're talking about the fantasy part of speculative poetry, there's mostly three kinds. There's stuff based on myths, stuff based on fairy tales, maybe there's a fourth, stuff based on literary things that are fantastic. I'm thinking of, like, I have a poem about Ariel from The Tempest. I have a poem that's about to be published in Uncanny about, it's called Wendy Waiting. It's about Peter Pan. Actually, it's about Wendy. But is that actually not too speculative now that I think about it? But it is, because Peter Pan is the boy who doesn't get old. And then just made-up worlds. So it could be, and it could be contemporary made-up world. It could be medieval-ish or what have you. So I thought that I would, I'm trying to remember where I put this, read you some speculative stuff. Oh, so why did I create this thing called Sycorax Press? Well, I wanted to be published, and the SFPA doesn't just hand out Dwarf Star Awards for poems 10 lines and less, and then long poem and short poem Riesling Awards. It also has Elgin Awards for chapbooks and poetry collections. So I was like, okay, I'll go through the Elgin Awards because any other search really comes up with no publishers. And what did I discover? Almost all of the books that had been published were the science fiction kind. Almost all of the presses were closed to submissions. Actually, I am too, but for now. Almost all of the presses, or a good number of presses, were really basically self-publishing, but they created a name for their press, and there you have it. So there aren't places to go. Of course, now I understand why now that I got into it, there's not a lot of sales to be had. But, so there's no profit. So that's what it is. But I had wanted to create a press that only did speculative poetry. So, so far, I did my own book first to make sure I could do it. And that's The Bone Joiner, which is the one on the far left. The second one is mine, but it was published by Flutter Press, which is a small press, or was a small press. I just published The Year of the Witch by Shannon Connor Winward, who actually is a Delaware poet who is, at this very moment, also giving a reading. And the other is Dame Evergreen by Rebecca Buchanan. And they're really fine books. And in January, Alexandra Seidel, I'll be doing a book by her. So, I thought I'd show you the press. So, I like that image. It's an Art Nouveau painting, and it's not a famous painter. I don't remember. I think he's Polish. And actually, does everyone here know who Sycorax is? Probably not. Does anyone watch Dr. Who and know who that Sycorax is? The Sycorax are a race of evil beings, but that's not who I named it for. Sycorax is the mother of Caliban in The Tempest, and she's never on stage, but she is the witch who peopled the island before Prospero got there. And considering that, well, first of all, I used to dress up as a hag at a medieval festival for many years, and I called myself Sycorax. That's the real reason. But the other reason is that I think of Sycorax as being marginalized. In fact, she's been embraced by a lot of the African American community. And I had the idea for the press name a while ago, and before I came out with this, there was an anthology about a year ago, and they used Sycorax as the model. So, because it's believed that Sycorax the witch probably was not African American, but she was a person of color. So, interestingly enough, I found this, which is very starry and everything, but her race is kind of nebulous, right? It's really hard to tell what she is, and I like that. I thought that was good. So, the books are listed here. And then there's the journal, which just came into being on Halloween. So I own that painting, just like Marcia Sandmeyer Wilson was a painter who lived in Leonia, New Jersey. And right now I'm not open to submissions, but I will be open to general submissions later in the year. I'm not sure how that will, what the time commitment will be, which is why I did that. So I thought that I would start with, I'm not seeing them. That's interesting. I know I put them in there, but okay. Really is weird. It's probably in here and I'm not seeing it. Oh, because it's right here. It is right here. Does anyone here know who Jane Yolen is? Okay, Jane Yolen is like a goddess. She just won the World Fantasy Award for Best Collection for a book called The Emerald Circus. She has published over 365 books in fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and children's writings, and she's incredible. And mostly she writes speculative stuff, and she also writes speculative poetry. So the first, I did not set a theme for the first issue of the journal. In fact, I probably don't want a theme, and the reason is, as a submitter, it gets very annoying when every time you want to submit something, a lot of journals only have themes, and you have like these 6 poems to send out and they don't fit anybody's themes. So it's like, do I want to do that to other people? No, I don't. So I just took, I didn't take everything that came, even though it was by invitation, and I saved a lot of poems for the second issue because these are my favorite speculative poets. I'll read you Jane's Severance. I'll put it up there too. But the interesting thing is, I knew that I was going to accept this poem. She submitted all her poems to me before the Kavanaugh hearings. You're going to want to hear it in context now. The Armless Maiden is a grim fairy tale. Severance, The Armless Maiden Speaks by Jane Yolen. It takes time, not miracles, to heal. That small growth, a finger's length. Who has not heard that story? It takes a packing of moss and mud, a turn of cloth around the stump, prayers in the darkest woods, fine stitching of gold. I lost my innocence to a man who bound my mouth. He called it love. I called it severance. I wed the next one because he set me free. My hands grew back like the lizard's tail, till I could write with fingers shaped like stories, and a mouth that could sing with the phrases of birds. Now, I don't know about you, but when I reread this poem after the Kavanaugh hearings and read, I lost my innocence to a man who bound my mouth, I got chills. So you may think to yourself, what do fairy tales have to do with life, my life, the real world? What do myths have to do? The point is, like all good writing, speculative fiction is about human beings. Whether they are disguised as dragons or whether they are six-headed monsters, it's about the human condition. So it doesn't matter that this comes from a fairy tale. The impetus comes from a fairy tale, but the truths are still truths. The other one from, just to give you a slight just sense of things, I wanted to read Megan Arkenberg's The Oracle Retires. The last card is the apple tree. Fruit brown like drops of menstrual blood, snakes in its roots, the card of investment. The card that means moving houses, trading a twin bed for a double, calling when you're late. She leaves it on the table. The window is open, smelling of the sea. She goes to the window and lights a cigarette, watches the summer people's linen and straw hats drifting by on the sidewalk. The house stands 2 blocks from the beach. The sun and moon painted on her door, locked in a permanent quarrel, their teeth bared and smudged by incense smoke. Nail between her lips, she flips her sign and posts, "Going out of business," and pauses, and adds as an afterthought, "The future is not a god. It does not get to demand sacrifices." So it has as its main theme, an oracle and whatever, but the story is not based on any particular story. And Rose Lemberg is another great author. I'm so terrible at doing this. And I just, come on. Divinatory. Hold 4 stones, a divination in an uncaring world. The earth speaks through stones, the foundation of all that is and all that would be, underfoot, invisible, wounded and yet wise, growing each stone into a mountain. Hold a reversed avalanche, a divination in a world of loss. The earth continues to speak, undoing the wounds of a drought-parched garden, unpulled weed, and a dried sea pod, a quickening of hope in this most desolate ground, stubbornly reborn. Hold a moon in your hand, a lantern, a door once more into this work that endlessly awaits me and is endlessly done. A walk through the darkening wood in which the earth is my mentor, my guardian, my long-lost sister, myself, torn out of the womb and discarded, stubbornly reborn, falling seed-like underfoot, and I follow. And one word more,